You may remember the long list of organisations which strongly condemned that decision by the Finance Ministry to exempt Eskom from parts of the Public Finance Management Act. Now, of course, the exemption has itself been lifted. That was the first retraction by government today. One of the organisations which was very, very angry with the National Treasury for granting this exception in the first place for Eskom was the Progressive Professionals Forum. Their president is Kashif Wicomb. Kashif, good afternoon to you. Well, now the Minister, Ina Godongwana, has withdrawn the exemption for Eskom. How do you feel about it all now?
Good afternoon, Stephen. You know, an hour in politics is long. So this morning at 8:30 we were, well, 6:30 we were calling for withdrawal. It happened, and then less than half an hour later thereafter, the national state of disaster was also cancelled, which we find extremely strange. But with regards to the issue at hand, you know, the country faces, or the state and the ruling party faces, a large trust deficit amongst its people, amongst its investors, and most importantly also amongst the people, the patriotic engineers and staff who work in entities such as Eskom. So for the Minister of Finance to have made this announcement on Friday, it just clarified or emphasized or drove home the message that certainly the state is not committed to accountability, transparency, and corporate governance. And those three major issues, in fact, is what the nation requires from the SOEs, especially Eskom, at this particular stage. But we want to then say, if one can spin it, we have a listening government. Will listen to organizations such as ourselves and will then withdraw their position.
I mean, there's so much to this, right? You say that you also want the State-Owned Entity Act, and there's supposed to be changes. This came out of the ANC conference. There's supposed to be changes that will go through, that will basically manage how state-owned entities are managed, and it's a very complex thing. You suggest we need that act quite quickly. I think many people probably agree with you, and this is probably the perfect example to show that. The problem is, it's quite a technical piece of legislation, and we have had, frankly, problems, let me be more journalistically honest, disasters in state-owned entities quite recently. We need to get this act right. Do you really think it can be rushed through Parliament to stop this kind of problem from happening again?
Look, I know. In 2012, there was a presidential review on SOEs published. 2012, that's 13 years ago. 11 years ago. And part of that panel recommendation was a number of stuff. And we as a PPF have done analysis globally in terms of what SOE, where do SOEs work and where do they work well. One of the first interventions is an SOE Act. Now you must understand what currently happens is that Eskom, Transnet, and there are 736 SOEs in the country, by the way. There are 5 or so that we all speak about, but proudly South African is in SOE. Caledon Water is in SOE, etc. Matola Water is in SOE. So the acts which govern these SOEs are at many times in conflict with each other. So you've got the PFMA, you've got the Companies Act, you've got the King 2 report. So which legislation supersedes the other? So the objective and purpose of the SOE Act is, number one, to have a uniform act which governs SOEs, especially from an accountability, transparency and corporate governance point of view, but also to not necessarily limit, but determine the involvement of the state in these SOEs, which then brings us to the second recommendation, which the PPF has been advocating for, and that is an SOE holding company. Now, if you look at successful SOEs globally, you look at France, China, Singapore, Canada, etc. Singapore's got a holding company called Temasek, an SOE holding company which reports to the shareholder, which is the state, once a year. But other than that, for 364 days of the year, the SOE holding company takes full control and management of the SOE with the competent board and with the competent CEO. Now, what we are calling for here today is not new. We've done so since 2019. But most importantly, in 2021, during the State of the Nation address, our President Ramaphosa, announced that an SOE Act will be promulgated. It's 2.5 years later. He then announced in 2023 the idea around an SOE, around the SOE Act. So what we are saying, it's been 2 years. this crisis that we are facing, both at Eskom and with this announcement and then withdrawal of our corporate governance issues, should take place in an SOE. Here's the SOE Act, which there are case studies for globally that we can not cut and paste, but we can massage to our particular local South African environment.
And Kashif, there's so many different things to this. I mean, you refer to the second attraction of the day, the national state of disaster, no longer in place around electricity, of course. I have to tell you, I mean, I think many people may be watching all of this, many of our viewers, you at home, may be watching all of this and thinking, I don't know if government really knows, and I say this quite carefully, I don't know if government really knows what it's doing.
It would appear that way. I think what is also important is that we find that our government is being run and managed by the courts of law. In both these particular instances, or in the one instance around the state of disaster, I think the state was taken to court by AfriForum. And so I don't know if that was the ultimate reason or first reason or primary reason for the change of heart, if one can call it that. But I also think that when the state makes a decision, I said at the beginning it must be a listening government, and we are thankful for that. But also when it makes a decision and the decision is a firm one, the decision must also be it must be a justifiable one and a legally bulletproof one. In order so that we can't have this toing and froing. As the PPF, we supported the state of disaster. We believe that the load shedding that faces us as a nation is in fact a state of disaster. And so the state must do everything in its power to get rid of load shedding. Now, it cannot do everything in its power to get rid of load shedding if it must follow the tedious procurement processes which a state-owned entity normally follows. Now, of course, here we are opening the door for the corruption which took place during COVID in 2020. But we learn from our experiences, and we say we can have so-called emergency procurement provided there are checks and balances in place. I can also add that we mustn't forget that SOEs such as Eskom have got patriotic professionals who are in there and who will ensure that the family jewels does not get given away during a state of disaster such as the one that we had.
Kashif Wicomb, thank you, President of the Progressive Professionals Forum.